I have the opportunity now to introduce our panel of experts. They come to the stage for our first panel discussion, the dark side of data. And again, focusing in on what is good, what is bad, and how's it going to be used. When information is weaponized is really the foremost topic of concern as we look at data of the future. Our moderator, Ken Delanian, is the national security reporter for NBC News. Ken? Dr. Rick Forno is a senior lecturer for cybersecurity at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Brigadier General retired Scott Bethel is president, ISR Integrity. Jeff Chapman, CEO, Babel Street. Andre Pinar, Executive Officer for C5 Capital. And finally, Marin Katanar, co-founder, Automated Analytics, and also Innovation Manager, MIT Deshpande Center for Technological Innovation.
Thanks very much. Good morning. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone that we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the discussion. So submit your questions via the event app when I signal it's time for Q&A. You know, this is a subject that I've been kind of marinating in over the last 2 years as I cover the Robert Mueller special counsel investigation into how the Russians interfered in our politics, in part by manipulating data. And unfortunately, sadly, today it's an incredibly, this panel has been planned for a long time. It's an incredibly appropriate time to have this discussion because we have a situation where we have a caravan of migrants heading toward the southern border. There's been a ton of misinformation about it on social media, in the mainstream news media. A guest on Fox News this week said that some of the immigrants in that caravan had smallpox, a disease that's been eradicated from the globe. The president has sent troops to repel this so-called invasion, and sadly, a deranged man in Pittsburgh believed that this caravan was funded by Jewish groups, and he went into a synagogue and shot 11 people to death. So the real-world implications of weaponized data. Let me start with you, Rick. In a recent article in The Conversation, you wrote that we've, in some ways, moved beyond the era of conventional warfare. This is a new, more perilous frontier. Tell us what that is and what it means.
Well, I think we heard part of what it means in the previous session, but I think when we look at this from both a technical perspective and an informational perspective, I like to view it in a threefold prism. There's the physical dimension that we operate in the real world and in cyberspace. There's also the informational medium, the messaging, what's being conveyed. Again, whether it's on a network, bits and bytes, or communication in the news media. And then there's also what I call the third aspect, the third leg of this prism is what I would call the cognitive element. And that's really what I think where the danger is in many ways, because whatever we do, whether it's cyber warfare, cybersecurity, journalism, medical research, you name it, anything we do revolves around the most complicated computer system in the world, but also the one that's most vulnerable and the easiest one to exploit, and that's the human brain. And the cognitive element, therefore, I think is really where a lot of the emphasis we're seeing these days with things like fake news and cyber is converging.
One of the things that's been clear is we don't really have a defense against this in terms of the government. There's no government-wide effort to combat this problem. There's private sector efforts, though. And Scott, you're involved in one of them. Your company has an entire practice dedicated to helping combat weaponized data. What are some of the steps you're taking to address the threats?
Well, if you consider this, we're using the term weapon, which implies a certain military context. There are 5 warfighting domains: space, air, sea, land, cyber. Cyber is the only one that is completely man-made, man-manipulable, and where warfare occurs when people are buying sweaters, emailing their mom, and taking on other countries. So there's two ways to look at the defense against weaponized data. Nation states tend to go in volume, and so they tend to bombard the Facebook trilogy, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, with all kinds of data, with a perception of news. In the Middle East, for example, 93% of young people get all of their information through that, and then they respond on WhatsApp. For insurgents, they tend to be a lot more precise, because what they're trying to do is do command and control, and they're trying to do have an effort toward getting action out of a group. So ultimately, as a nation state, the defense is incredibly difficult, because insurgent groups are remarkably sophisticated and agile. So the way to defend against that is to increase the volume and the size of data to overpower and circumvent insurgent operations and objectives.
And give me one example of how that might work.
Well, so one super good example is, from a nation-state standpoint, Mr. Erdogan in Turkey is incredibly adept and has a very sophisticated network. And as the coup was happening nearly 2 years ago, the Turkish fake news or Turkish news sources were incredibly active in presenting his side of the situation. And it changed the tide of the population. On the insurgent side, the Palestinians have been super effective at mobilizing large groups of people, both to action and to action at the border and in support of, using very precise language and very precise images to get the population energized to act.
Jeff Chapman, your company Babel Street collects and analyzes publicly available information across more than 200 languages every day. What are some of the ways in which you're able to determine what is real and what is fake?
Yeah, it's a great question. First, I would say it's a very difficult challenge. If you think about what you're trying to determine, is it a fact or is it plausible? So if you think about the computer, we talk about automation. The computer is really doing the rules that we as humans program it to do, which is really based upon a lot of our decision-making cycle. So when we think about our decision-making cycle, the computer can take in more information and can process it faster than we can. So the same steps that we would do as humans to corroborate information, the computer is essentially going to do. We're going to look at the source. Does the source reported reliably in the past? What information is the source a specialist in? You can look at other things. So let's take, for instance, the source, if we think about the Onion versus the AP, right? I think hopefully we all know that, the Onion satire, although plenty of people that I know have been fooled by it. But if you think about that, even the AP, for instance, in 2003, a lot of people may not remember that their Twitter account was hacked in 2013. And for about 5 minutes, they put out a news story under the hackers did, that said that the president, the White House had been attacked and the president had been injured. In that short period of 5 minutes that could be resurrected, the Dow dropped billions of dollars, right? So in that case, you had what most folks perceived as a reliable source with fake information coming out in the case of hack, and they acted upon it. So when you think about it, generally speaking, it's, we look at the corroboration. So in that case, we would look for other sources that are reporting on that information to corroborate the information. And at the end of the day, when people ask, like, what is the ultimate solution to this, it's time. Because truth brings out time, or time brings out truth.
I hope you're right about that. Andre, do you agree with that question, that the truth will out in time? And what are some of the policy solutions to this that you envision? How can governments respond to this problem of manipulated data?
I think policy and the law are important tools in dealing with this challenge, but they need to be augmented by innovation driven by entrepreneurs. And as a venture capital firm, we have the privilege of being partnered with SAP NS2 in an accelerator focused on peace, on building a strong peace with the US Institute of Peace. And so we are scaling up startups and working with very innovative entrepreneurs who are building technologies, innovative technologies that can help prevent, predict, and mitigate conflict. And in this realm of war and peace, data has become absolutely central to this quest. And as President Reagan said, to build a strong peace, we need hope, confidence, and facts. And preserving facts and being able to preserve facts through innovation is, I think, at the heart of this mission. And as we've seen in the innovation economy, that the focus have moved from hardware to software to data. And so the focus of innovation is now on preserving the facts. And a very good example of that is a company called IronNet, led by General Keith Alexander, the former head of the NSA, which is focused on how we can use the cloud, how we can use innovation platforms like SAP HANA to share information, to share data at network speed to make sure that we protect not only companies and governments on their own, but joined up and in partnership and using a network collective defense model.
Aaron, from your work at MIT, what do you see as the most critical national security risks surrounding the weaponization of?
So I actually think that data has been weaponized for a significantly long amount of time. You can look at the events in Estonia, the Ukraine, ransomware attacks on hospitals. So it's nothing new. And I kind of wish there was a whiteboard up here because I'd rather have like a matrix that depicts on something technically being probable to happen from data weaponization to actually the likelihood of happening. So I'm going to take it away from people for just a second. I was watching a public television program the other day, and it featured the Concorde, which was quite a technical accomplishment. And then they also featured the copied version of the Concorde, dubbed the Konkorsky. And I kind of got a kick out of that. But it was just an example of the theft of intellectual property and how you can take one model and actually duplicate and maybe even improve upon it. So there are nation states that are stealing intellectual property and doing some really interesting stuff with it. So that's a probable and happening subject matter. I'm looking at my notes here. And then in addition to that, the improbable and not likely to happen, or the probable and not likely to happen are the OPM breach, where it stole individuals' data. And what if you coupled that data with the theft of data from a hospital or your 23andMe or Ancestry.com account? Could you then weaponize that information and create synthetic viruses using CRISPR, where you're doing gene editing and targeting a specific population? That scares the heck out of me. But at the same time, what you're looking at is something that is extremely costly and has a long duration. The panacea of something that is probable, and I'll call it pseudo-happening, is quantum computing. Once we actually get to that point, some experts, I was at a conference at MIT the other day where they said 5 years, and a friend of mine who works in quantum computing still says 30 years. But whoever gets there first will disrupt everything that we're talking about today. But what that enables is whoever does get there, it enables you to actually have new architectures for cybersecurity and solutions. And then really, I'm going to take it back to the people, but what you're looking at now that's probable and happening is misinformation, it's fake news, and it's how it influences people. And people are the ones who control the data, create the data, analyze the data, and make sense of the data. So you have mercenary actors or intentional actors that, with the examples right now of the synagogue shooting, the explosives that were sent in the mail, to nation states that are actually going after influencing elections. And then you have also the influence and unintentional influence, where someone clicks on a phishing email or plugs in an IoT device that's unsecure. So the crux of it is national security is jeopardized by the people, and I think how information is conveyed to those people influences that all.
Let's expand on that, Rick. The synagogue shooting, that's a self-inflicted wound. That's Americans hurting Americans based on false information. But how are adversaries using weaponized data? What are some more of the nightmare scenarios that you worry about that could affect the national security of the United States?
Well, I think talking about the genomic hacking is a huge one, and that does keep me up at night. Michael Crichton, actually, one of his last novels, talked about that very scenario, custom diseases. But what keeps me up at night is, again, going back to the idea of targeting the cognitive elements. Things not just like fake news that drives influence, but the application of technology by either nation states or individual actors. For example, the notion of deep fakes. We've seen very crude attempts of that to show, let's say, Barack Obama posing with somebody from Nazi Germany used in campaign promotions. Okay? A critical thinker would go, that couldn't happen. Obama wasn't even alive back then. But there was always some segment of the population that will say, that's true, he's cahooting with Nazis. So deep fakes, can you believe your eyes? Can you believe what you're seeing and presented as truth? The AP Twitter hack, for example. A critical thinker would go, wait a minute, is this being confirmed by the Washington Post or CNN or NBC? And if I'm not hearing about it from any other source, maybe I'll take a step back and not be so quick to retweet this. So it's a combination of, again, the ability to create influence messages at both the nation state level and individual level, whether it's a rogue actor or the Russian Internet Research Agency doing this sort of online trolling activity in a nation state effort, and the ability of just technology's normal advances to make it much easier for this to take place. Perhaps the best example of a weaponization of information in a military or an intelligence sense, I would say, would be Stuxnet. A few years ago, when the Iranian nuclear power plant was infected with a piece of malicious software that tricked the human operator into believing all was well in the centrifuges, when in reality, everything was not all right with the centrifuges, and we all know what happened in the aftermath of that. So here again, it's trust but verified, to quote Ronald Reagan again. The computers may not always be right, even though we're conditioned to believe it is. So Stuxnet, I think, is a great national security example of the weaponization of information in a tactical sense, if you will, or a kinetic sense, but then also influence and disinformation and misinformation is a more subtle and I think more sinister approach of weaponization towards influence goals.
General Bethel, I want to call on your military background to ask you this question, which is, a lot of this seems like an attack on the United States by adversaries. But it involves information. It's a place where the government is reluctant to get involved. We have a First Amendment. What are some of the possible government responses to this problem?
It's really tough because remember, all of this is happening generally on privatized platforms. And many of those privatized platforms are resistant to take responsibility because if they begin to initiate self-imposed restrictions on content, then how do you determine whether or not this content is really evil and that content is not evil?
Right.
Further, what is really tricky, again, we're really throwing around a lot of military terms. So let's use the term targeting. What is incredibly problematic with social media targeting is when you have a kinetic weapon, you can measure everything. What's the blast, what's the fragmentation, how far does the hole dig, et cetera, et cetera. In a social media attack, you don't have any of that advantage. So you can't do a battle damage assessment because you don't know how far your message or your effort will go. You can't do a collateral damage estimation because you're not sure how something will be retweeted or whether it'll be modified, narrated, amplified, diminished, et cetera. So ultimately, these are very sophisticated attacks that are sort of set off without any regard for what happens. So when we talk about whether there can be constraints and how to do that, I can tell you that from advising some of the platform owners, they are very concerned because when something goes bad, they're blamed. Yep. When things are good, then they are considered a boon to culture. Right. Countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, et cetera, constrain access to the platform. And they constrain how your searches go and so on. Right now, they are slowly opening that up and allowing some of those constraints to come off, but at great risk. And over the summer, a lot of them collapsed those and reinitiated some constraints. So to defend ourselves, it would be logical to have some constraints. The challenge is how deep, wide, and obtrusive with those constraints.
So many interesting points there, including why the government, our government, can't respond the way we would like because we don't know the implications of action on social media. We have laws against propaganda. We can't, tell lies that reach Americans, right? The CIA, the NSA can't do that. Jeff, what about with your private clients? When they are the victims of a misinformation campaign, how do you advise them to respond to that?
I'm sorry, when
the people who consume your database are the victims of a misinformation campaign. That you identify bogus information on social media. How do they respond? How do you advise them to respond?
Well, so we see laws coming out now that helps folks like this, specifically GDPR out of Europe. For those of you who don't know, GDPR is a new privacy regulation that while it pertains to the EU, it basically pertains to America. And the reason for that is because US corporations don't want to have two compliance standards, so they're simply just compliant with GDPR. So what that effectively does is give rights, and we'll see what's coming. GDPR was just passed in May, so we'll see what ends up happening to those that are affected by it. At the end of the day, we can put great technology in place, like we talked about earlier, to look at the source and look at the validity of the information. It's the human's going to take it the last mile. And I'll give you an example that if we rerun to, say, 1954, and the computer had been trained that no human runs sub 4-minute miles. Well, if the news had come across that Roger Bannister just broke the 4-minute mile, it would say this is fake news, right? Nobody does that. And so one of the things that we've got to be able to do is, as we automate this decision making for the computers, is to allow the flexibility of the computer to say, this is the possibility on a spectrum that it's likely, as opposed to a 1 or a 0. And then lastly, I go to education. I cannot overstate the importance for the future of the United States is that every citizen be imbued with the ability to understand what's being presented to them and make a decision based upon that information. Because without that is the crux of our democracy. And being able to decipher what's true and not. And I don't mean education in an erudite fashion. I just meant at a common sense level.
Yeah, and given the history of the last 2 years, you're not filling me with confidence there that we're solving this problem. Andre, you are an investor and you are familiar with cutting edge technology. Are there any technological solutions to this issue that could tell us, for example, what's a bot and a troll quickly so we can filter through this misinformation?
Innovation is definitely an important contributor to the solution to this problem, and can help in a significant way. And I want to pick up Jeff's point about education. I think there are a number of very innovative platforms now to train both government employees, private sector employees, but also communities at large about cybersecurity awareness. And I think we need to replicate that also on the data and on the information side. I started working on the internet when the internet still had about 20 million users. Today we have 3.5 billion people connected to the internet. We really have to rethink the way in which we train and educate people, and critical thinking and an ability to distinguish between what is true and what is false, what's a human and what's an avatar or a botnet, is a critical skill, life skill today, both in our businesses, in government, but also in life at large.
Right. Thanks. Maren, how do questions of privacy and freedom of speech shape the U.S. government's ability to pursue and interdict malicious actors suspected of spreading false or weaponized information?
So I think first and foremost, we really have to look at protecting our First Amendment rights. I think that is critically important, and that's something that should always be factored into the equation. You mentioned GDPR. That is being implemented in Europe. It's interesting to see how some companies and how some startups are executing to that. Whether or not they're following the appropriate protocol, I don't know, but we hope so. So I really think you don't necessarily want to focus on the actors, but you want to have an influence and to motivate the companies behind the social networks. And the reason being is the way that it's structured right now is that the companies are the ones that own the data. Tim Cook just recently spoke on the weaponization of data from the perspective of using your own data to sell advertising to you. So I think right now what you see is that there's this challenge of data ownership, and how that ties into the weaponization of data is critically important. So I don't want to be Orwellian because it's contradictory to the First Amendment rights, but if you look at other frameworks such as Sarbanes-Oxley and how that affects large corporations, or how the FCC curtails, I'll call it obscenities on the news, they'll fine NBC or ABC for something of that sort. So we have frameworks in place where data is well understood that has further controls on it. So I don't have an answer for you because I'm torn between the two, but I do believe that the federal government needs to find a way to motivate these corporations to be supportive of going after these actors.
It's an incredibly tough issue. I just want to encourage the audience to submit questions on the event app and to tell my masters here that I have no time cue, so I'm not sure how much time we have left. But there's a couple questions here. Scott, there are strategic and tactical parallels between the way weaponized data and other automated defensive capabilities are used. Can you describe how existing technology may have set the precedent?
Well, yes. I mean, the idea that you are able, so let's go back to the WhatsApp example. Right now, there are 183 million WhatsApp users just in the Horn of Africa. And of those 193 million users, there are some 600 million groups. And so a sophisticated actor can penetrate those groups and proliferate an idea, a data, a position that then either incites them to action or changes their overall opinion. And so starting with just the idea that you can have groups, and then those groups can be made larger, and then you can externally insert data is really important. And Marin noted that the idea of weaponizing data is not a new concept. There were plenty of Goebbels type guys over time, and essentially using a misinformation campaign to energize a population to act in an incredibly selfless way for a terrible objective. So the technology has existed that, as we've discussed across the whole panel, that the vulnerable component in this entire enterprise is the person. Yeah. And so how you get information or misinformation to the person and whether or not he's prepared to filter it or do his own research or however that's done. But if you can get to the person, that's the weak link in this chain.
I want to throw this out to anybody who wants to answer. I'm curious what people think. What's the bigger danger here? Is it the foreign adversaries using weaponized information, or is it our own political system? We're so divided. Each side accuses the other of fake news, and there's plenty of false information percolating through the system. Andre?
In President Reagan's great speech about building a strong peace, he said that one of the great strengths of this country is its ability to have an open conversation about complex issues based on the facts. And this is a great strength of America, which is recognized the world over. And I think preserving this gift, the strength of this great republic, is must be one of the key objectives, and probably the greatest risk to democracy if this is lost.
I would add to that and say, we talk about weaponization of information being external or internal. I would also say the internal weaponization to create polarization domestically, where you can weaponize information, and I'll use that term very loosely, weaponization, to create echo chambers on the left and in the right, and according to special interests, those groups that you were referring to reinforce people's views and further drive polarization. I think that's sort of an unspoken but very, very dangerous side effect that we need to address. Bottom line, the weaponization of information, it's not just a technical problem, it's not just a human problem, it requires us to address both, but unfortunately I think we tend to skew more towards the technical solution than the educational side.
And then lastly, because we're running out of time, what do you guys see as likely going forward? The Russians were incredibly successful by hacking and releasing emails, but they didn't change the content of those emails as far as we know, except in maybe a couple of cases. Can you envision a time where information is released where the content is tweaked slightly that makes it more explosive? That seems to be exponentially more dangerous, and how do we deal with that? Who wants to take that one?
Well, in 2015, the Russian defense minister at a military media event, the media festival, said, words also shoot. And so if that gives you the context of the way the Russians view information warfare, we're going to continue to see the threat. And to your previous question, I think by far and away the foreign adversary threat to the U.S. is much bigger simply because of the resources that can be put towards the problem. Whereas if you have an individual small group, be it on either side of the political spectrum, they pale in comparison to what the Russians can bring to bear in the information warfare space.
Final thoughts, Mike?
Yeah, and just real quickly, I mentioned CRISPR before, but when I think about some of our adversaries, they look at things in a different way, and they have a different ethical standard, and that plays a big role into all of what we're talking about today. So no matter what we do as a nation state within the U.S. or with Western civilization in Europe, there are always going to be folks that aren't going to play by our rule book, and that's something that is really important.
And last thing I'll throw out there is that though the Mueller investigation is not complete, the majority of what the Russians may have done during the election was not technically illegal. Right. They were able to access existing social media platforms, proliferate tons of data, which was then retweeted or retransmitted by people to create this web. And so until those standards are clarified and made right, it will continue to happen because it's not against the law.
And they have continued to do it in the subsequent months. And on that cheery note, we're out of time. Thanks for listening, guys.